So listen, we know that Stu rather has a successful territory and carries a lot of weight in the industry, peer to peer. He's going to become a legendary trainer from guys all over America, Canada, even Japan. But once upon a time, he turns the book over for the creative to Bruce and Keith. And I don't think that worked as well. What can you tell us about Stampede and maybe the downhill slope?
Well, I just think that, more than anything, the business was changing in general. And I don't know that Stu necessarily, I think a lot of the old timers after a while, like Paul Bosch, when he was ready to get out, you get to a point where you're sick of dealing with the talent. You're sick of dealing with it. And you either hand it over to somebody else or you get out of it altogether. And Stu had, his children there that he could hand it over to. And I don't think it gets talked about enough, but I think that people, Bruce Hart booked, and I don't know that he was the greatest booker in the world at that time, but I will say this about Bruce Hart, because that's not Bruce. Well, Bruce is in the background there. There he is. Bruce, to me, had one of the most creative minds that I've ever seen. I thought that where Bruce was absolutely brilliant at was telling stories. And I just don't know that he had the time. And what I mean by that is that he had the time to really allow the stories to develop because he was deep, man. He was deep into storytelling. And he would send letters, man, with stories that were, I thought, magnificent. I just think that he was probably way ahead of his time. And you would listen to Bruce, and sometimes I think people dismissed him. But man, he was, to me, I thought he was a great storyteller.
Why didn't he work with you guys? Why didn't he work with the WWE?
Well, I think that there were times that, tried and just for whatever reason didn't work out. But I go back to the Owen and BRET story, man. That was pitched by Bruce to be Bruce and BRET. And it became Owen. But the depth of story, man, a lot of that was from Bruce. And he would often, just to read a letter from Bruce Hart is, first of all, it's several pages long. But it's well thought out, man. I just, and for whatever reason, man, I think that Bruce had if he was channeled in the right way, man, good Lord. I thought that he had his gift was telling stories.
74 years old. He's still with us. Hopefully, he hears about the high praise that you gave him here today, and it brightens his day a little bit. It is interesting to think, what could have been if he would have been helping with creative all those years ago with WWE.
Yeah, I think it's just more than anything a channeling of those ideas.
The end of Stampede comes, I think, when Vince makes a deal to buy Stampede out, and there's been some controversial discussion over the years about whether or not that deal was seen all the way through. What did you ever hear about the end of Stampede?
I just heard Stu was, we were taking, look, the stars were coming into WWE, and Vince bought out the territory and gave Stu a check, for taking the talent and got the TV. And I have no idea, anything beyond that.
We should talk about Amarillo, Dory Funk, not Junior, but the daddy. Man, he had Western States sports, and so many wrestlers that we've heard of came out of West Texas. I mean, my goodness. Well, what can you tell us about Amarillo and Dory's style of booking? I mean, we know what kind of weight maybe that a guy like Stu Hart would carry in the community. We know about some of the consistent great wrestling that we saw in Portland. We know we could always count on the battle royals in Roy Shire in San Francisco. What about Dory Funk? What were some of his trademarks? I know you grew up in the Texas area, so this is one you're going to be very familiar with.
Well, Dory Funk Sr. was, look, I'm partial. Yeah. because I grew up, I was born in El Paso, which was an Amarillo town. Amarillo ran Amarillo, Lubbock, Abilene, El Paso ran some of New Mexico, Albuquerque, Las Cruces, and then every canyon, every single town in between. So they ran the Panhandle, if you will, West Texas. And Dory was a brilliant, just great mind for the business. He understood psychology, did like, a little bit of the blood and guts. He was a king of the Texas death matches. I'll go off on a tangent here, but the Texas death match, the way it used to be billed was could take 2 falls or 22 falls. The match goes until one man can't continue.
Yeah, there's
half falls. You have a fall, then you have a 1 minute rest period, and then the guy gets a 10 count. If it's to the finish, it's to the finish. Just beat them once. But anyway, that was always my pet peeve with Texas Death Match. But Dory was king of the Texas Death Match. They would, legend. Oh my God, I went 66 falls. But a lot of blood and things like that. Dory was a really rough competitor, but he ruled with an iron fist. And Dory booked it. And legend has it. And again, this is where history depends on who's telling you the history. Because I've heard both. I've heard that Eddie Graham, who one of the greatest minds that the business has ever had as well, and people credit for so much in the business, that Dory learned from Eddie Graham. But then I've also heard that Eddie Graham went to Dory to learn from Dory. Now, they were contemporaries, and they both kind of took over things at about the same time. But, the people in the Eddie Graham camp are going to say Eddie Graham taught Dory. People in the Dory camp are going to say that Eddie learned from Dory. So they both had very similar styles. They were both good friends and ran their territories very similar. Dory Sr., who had come from Indiana originally, was involved in the Boys Ranch and the Boys Club in West Texas, which then that's why Eddie Graham got involved in the Boys Club and everything in Florida. It's their careers very, very similar stories. But Dory, ran, he had his sons as the baby faces, and Dory and Terry, but he just saw so much more for them and wanted them to be world champion. Knew that he would never be world champion, but by God, he had 2 offspring that definitely could be world champions. And he petitioned hard for them to be world champion, specifically Dory at the time, because Dory was older and had passed on since Terry came. But Dory ran the territory. He ran it. It was his head. It was his ideas. He had people like Ricky Romero, who was top babyface in the territory as well. And Ricky would help out from time to time with the book. Ricky Romero was Jay Youngblood's dad, the Youngblood. So he was a bright guy, but he drew, especially, man, from the Hispanic community. And West Texas has a heavy Hispanic community. So Ricky was always in a very prominent spot.